All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our last professional development session for this spring, promoting U.S. financial literacy. Before we get started, I'd like to make a few introductions. First, I want to introduce you to our newest community engagement department intern, Grady Trexler. He is going to be helping us out with tech issues this evening. We'll be helping out with the presentation and monitoring participants for unmuted microphones if necessary. But our panelists this evening, in order of their presentations, Jim Patterman, who is one of the co-leaders of the Greater Hartford Refugee Resettlement Coalition, which is based out of the First Congregational Church in Farmington. And our second presenter is Nancy Twynham, who helps out with financial issues at New Start Ministry, which is based at St. Paul's Episcopal in Woodbury. And last but not least, did I say Woodbury?
You said Waterbury. It's Woodbury.
Oh, Woodbury. Sorry, they resettled the family in Waterbury. Anyway, my bad. Finally, Rich Stein is one of the three co-chairs of the Interfaith Partnership for Refugee Resettlement based in Newtown. So this evening, all three of your co-sponsor peers will be presenting on U.S. financial literacy. After each of their sections, you will have an opportunity to ask questions and or offer a brief vignette that might mirror an experience you had in your group, because everyone who is registered this evening is actually part of an existing group. So some of this will be review. But if there are new members of your group who have never gone through this before, this will be new information for them. So without further ado, I'm going to let Jim Fetterman start. And Grady, if you could please start the presentation, please.
So we're basically, many of you have been through a lot of this before, so it's not going to be new stuff. But it's just our perspective. This is the agenda of what we're going through in terms of how we help provide the family with information to help them be more financially literate, because a lot of the environments they come from, they don't necessarily are not used to the US system of finance and how to manage your budgets. So this would include identification, really important. Assistance income, obviously that's a big supplement to their overall income situation. Taxes, budgeting and money management, scams, you have to watch out for scams. And so Nancy will be going through that. Tasks of the finance team beyond financial literacy. And so Nancy will share her experience with that. Banking, Rich is our banking expert, and then establishing good credit score, which is really important for them if they want to get any kind of loan going forward. Next slide, please. So the family we have is from Miramar. They have 5 wonderful children, and they arrived just before, like, the November before the pandemic. So it's been a wild and woolly ride with the pandemic and some of the challenges you have in trying to do some of these things when you can't necessarily get physical access to some of these areas. But obviously the first piece of identification that's really important is the family, the travel document. You can see that basically it has the alien number. It is really their first US based ID reference, because many of them don't have passports or anything like that. It also has the benefit that it serves as a picture ID. Sometimes banks will accept it, sometimes they don't. And it's valid for 1 year. Next slide, please. You can see that good old Social Security card, that's really critical for any kind of identification in the US. And basically the way it works is IRIS supplies the completed application, and this is probably what you experience, for the family, and they send it to the sponsor group leader. And then at that point, you have to take the entire family down to the Social Security office. And this is very much like an expedition, especially if there's kids involved. You can imagine, like in this case, a family of 5 trying to take kids to a Social Security office is very logistically challenging. The one thing we advise is go early in the morning, because there tends to be less of a line or a wait for going there the first thing in the morning. And then make sure that you have the logistics worked out in terms of who's going to be the drivers. You might need 2 cars if there's a family, more than a car can accommodate. Car seats, snacks, books, and toys. Keep the kids occupied so they don't create too much distraction for the people in the Social Security office. And then what we did is we made cell phone pictures of the actual cards, because it's good for reference when you need it. And then we kept that on a restricted Google Drive site. I'm sure that many of your family, many of your groups may have done something different, but Google is a good tool, especially because you can restrict who has access to this to keep their privacy under wraps. Next slide, please. The next one is the DSS cards, so the Department of Social Services. Basically, again, IRIS fills out the application for the temporary family assistance, which is the cash that they get every month. And that's really critical, especially as they may not be employed in the beginning. And Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or as most people know it, food stamps. And this, again, is sent to the sponsor leaders. It's important that they show a receipt to the Social Security application for every family member, so that the DSS knows that they have had their Social Security applied for, but they may not have received the card. And then go pick up the cards. It's an EBT card. You can see that silver one up in the center of there. It says Connect card. That's what the EBT card goes to. And basically also they need to get their Husky Medicaid medical cards so that they can get all their checkups and what have you. It's good to pick the closest DSS office. We suggest that, obviously they want to get that as soon as possible, but wait till the second full day, because everybody is really wiped out from travel, because they generally have come from a 6 or more hour time zone change. And so they're really beat, plus the stress of traveling that long distance and being in a brand new country. The children are not required, but one of the challenges we had is that they're sometimes reluctant to give a stranger to give childcare. So you have to play that one by ear. And then the good thing is that the DSS does have translation services that are provided for most languages. For example, our family speaks a dialect of Burmese, which is Karen, and they do have translators for Karen, which is very unusual. The next identification is really critical. It's the kind of the driver's license light, because it's very difficult to get a driver's license, especially if you don't know the language, and all the hoops you have to go through in the U.S. to get a driver's license. So what we suggest is you go for a Connecticut non-driver's license identification card, which you can see an example of that in the lower slide there in the center. Basically, you need 2 pieces of mail with the current address. And this is sometimes difficult because the utilities are generally paid by IRIS or the sponsor group until the Social Security card arrives. So we've at times even sent them a personal letter saying, "Hi, how you doing?" And so if you have an envelope that is addressed to them and is stomped to that address, then it generally works. And again, depends on who's at the DMV, whether or not they'll let you have it or not. Next slide, please. The next one is the employment authorization card. Obviously, this is tied to the refugee application process, and it's triggered when they arrive at the country. The address that they applied for the Social Security is where it generally arrives, and it could go to there or to IRIS or both. So it's not always clear. I'm sure you've had your own experience of where does it arrive, and it's not always clear where it's going to arrive, but usually it's at IRIS or at their physical address. They can use the travel document. It has a stamp on it that basically says this can be used as a work permit until such time that they receive these cards. And of course, that travel document's good for a year. And then this actual employment authorization card is good for 2 years. So it's important that they, after 1 year, they can apply for the green card. And so it's important that they start that process, because after 2 years, it turns into a pumpkin unless they go ahead and get an extension before the expiration. Next slide, please. We had this system, yeah, good old Excel spreadsheet. This is actually a Google spreadsheet because Excel costs too much these days. And so we manage our passwords on a spreadsheet, and it's a good place to keep lists of all the different accounts they have. And you can see here is an example, the one on the left, how many accounts they did have. And it's good to give the family a hard copy that they keep in a secure place on a periodic basis. You can keep the master until such time you hand over their life to them, which is usually after about 6 months. Have a password reset or change protocol in place, because sometimes there's a lot of two-factor authentication or whatever. Usually the email address of one of the people, if you have their email account, it's good because you can use that as the method for getting a password reset or what have you. And then eventually try to get the family, and again, this is challenging if they're not computer literate, to have them move to some kind of password keeper like LastPass, First Password, or Dashlane. Google also has their own manager that works pretty good as well. And these are all free. They have more upgraded subscription you can get if you want more powerful capabilities there. And then the other thing is to make sure that you have somebody usually who's managing the finances be an authorized rep when it makes sense. And this applies mainly to the DSS, the Department of Social Services, because there you have to update a lot of the information on that website. And if you're an authorized representative, then you can actually contact them in person and make some of the changes to help with some of the logistics. Again, we always did that with the family members involved with a translator, so they understood what we were doing. But in some cases, it was more expedient just to do it ourselves because there was a time urgent event that had to occur. The other place that's good to have a designated rep is you can be the tax preparer for their annual tax return. So that's another good way to use an authorized representation from one of the volunteer finance members. Next slide, please. And then assistance income, basically, IRIS performs the initial application. And the first thing is obviously the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Programs, or SNAP. And you can see, I don't know whether you can read these on the right, they're kind of eye charts, but I think we'll be giving out hard copies, so you'll have this in assistant, but it gives you some basic guideline as to what the income limits are and what the amount that's provided based on the number of family members on the chart below. Also, the EBT card is usually loaded the first through the third. It could be the first, second, or third, depending on the initial of their last name. You know, so if it's an A, they'll, if they're Appleby or Anchois, they'll get their check on the first of the month, or they'll get the money deposited to the ABT card. SNAP can only be used for food, so things like paper goods, cleaning goods, pharmaceutical stuff, you know, medications, what have you, that are over the counter. None of that is available. Obviously, alcohol, things like that aren't attainable through food stamps. It's just for food. Order food online is now available. Online delivery is now available at Aldi, Amazon, Walmart, and ShopRite. But sometimes that setting that up and coordinating that is more trouble than having them physically go there. So we haven't actually done it ourselves, but it's just so you're aware that that capability was there, especially when the pandemic was happening. This would have been really useful. The program is indefinite based on the fact that they qualify based on income. So again, based on the chart in the upper right-hand side there, if they are below the income threshold, they will get some assistance. Obviously, the more income they have, the less assistance they'll get, and there's a threshold where they won't get any assistance. And we found out that there's an app called Fresh EBT, and that's really slick because it gives the family member and the financial members of your team access to see what their actual usage and balance is on their both the SNAP and the TFA. And to get into it, you just use your EBT login to access the data. Next slide, please. DSS temporary family assistance, which is that cash is really critical, and it's good for 21 months. And it has the ability for 2 6-month extension if they have hardships in terms of their financial situation. It needs to be renewed after 12 months. If it's not, it stops. So it's really important. And that's where, if you have the ability to be a representative, you can help fill out the forms necessary to renew that. And that's really critical. In order to keep, to be able to qualify for the TFA after 1 year, they can't have more than $3,000 in the bank or any other assets. I'll go into this a little bit more detailed down the road. And all work age adults must have employment. That is anybody that's between 18 and 55 years old. And this includes part-time. In other words, that can count towards employment if you're working part-time. Next slide, please. DSF refugee status updates. So what happens is during the time that they're here, there's a lot of changes that can occur. For example, if they change employers or if their income changes, you need to notify them through this website. And it's that one that says use https connect.ct.gov/access. And it's also important that if there's a change of address, that you make that change. And any dependent changes need to be updated in this that particular website location. This results in a notice of action letter that summarizes the changes and the benefits that occur. It's important to check that out because we had a situation where we said that the income was going down because of you had to work part-time because of the COVID situation, and they actually increased the or decreased the food stamps. We said, what's with this? You know, so you have to keep checking that. We had to call them up, and there was a misunderstanding in the way that the employer was recorded, and they double recorded the income. So it's important that you check that notice of action letter to make sure it jives with what you made in terms of the changes. Check this website weekly after the change so that you can also talk to the family about what that change says. And then it's also, what we did is we have access to ADP, which is the website that most companies seem to use unless they're a small private company to manage their payroll. And with this, you can keep on top of salary changes and overtime, things like that. Now, again, this is really intrusive, but our family has been very supportive of us having access to this information. I'll answer that question about access to the ADP when we get to the Q&A section. Then also you need to renew the TFA after 1 year, as I mentioned. It should be, as I mentioned, one of the volunteers should do that. It's maybe your finance volunteer. You need to get that bank account down to $3,000. This does not include tax refunds that have child and employment tax credits. So that doesn't count. Obviously, stimulus income, which is probably a one-time deal, we hope, because of the pandemic. And then just recently, they changed it so unemployment compensation, it doesn't count towards that 3,000. So it's complicated, but you know, it's something that you got to do. The way we were able to, they had really done a great job and saved like almost $15,000 at that point because of all the stimulus checks they were getting and everything. And they were managing their money real well. So what we did is we paid off their $7,000 travel loan. And the challenge with that is that Rich will tell you how they use the travel loan to help to establish credit. So if you can do it over a period of time, but you know, we were in a hurry because we had to get it down before this application, the 1 year application. So that's why it's good to have a good horizon on what's going on when you get up to that renewal period after 1 year to see how you can systematically bring it down without having to knee jerk around a bit. And then the other one is, the other thing we did is we had them pay like 3 months in rent in advance, and that got their bank account down. And then, you know, of course, you know, it is kind of working around the system, but it seemed to work, and they're still qualified for their TFA. So that's been effective. Next slide. Energy assistance. It's important that you sign a volunteer to help them with this. It's a laborious process. It's not, as I say, not for the faint of heart. It took us 34 pages, and it did yield about $600 over the winter in heating credits. Of course, we haven't seen them yet, but they said it's in the mail. And it's not applicable for oil heat. And I think also, if the heat is in the rent, then it doesn't cover that. Next slide, please. Taxes, there are good volunteer services out there. There's the first two that I mentioned. There's more than this, but the IRS has a support area line. I give that link, and then the VITA, which is volunteer income tax assistance, or you can have the family work with you, one of the volunteers, to do it. And we actually use TurboTax and to help get them for their, and that was great because that helped them qualify for getting their first stimulus check in their bank account direct without having to go through the mail. So that got them registered in the IRS, because the first year we filed a $0 tax return for them. But for 2020, we had to go to regular TurboTax, and we paid the $50 for that. That was pretty reasonable, and it's pretty automated. And even though they had child tax credits and things like that, it seemed to go pretty smoothly. The tax filing obviously is a really high priority because of the refunds that are substantial, and it can be somewhere, again, it varies on the family, but it can be anywhere between $5,000 and $15,000 in rebates because of the child and income tax credits that they qualify for, generally because their income is low. It's sometimes better to have one of the volunteers from your group do the taxes, because trying to get these volunteer organizations set up is hard, because you have to wait in line sometimes hours, and if they have a family with kids and so forth, it can be very challenging. So we suggest that you use that. In fact, we had a family in Somalia that was a Somali family when I was living in another state, and we actually used H&R Block, and it cost $200, but they got a lot of money back, so it certainly paid for itself. Next slide, please. Okay, that's it for that section. So I think I had a couple questions there. I'm not sure how I get them to come back up there in the chat.
I'm happy to read the questions out. I think the first one you got was about June was asking if they could get more information about the password keepers, but maybe like to be emailed at a later date, about like LastPass and first password.
Yeah, the best thing to do there is just go online and look them up, those names that I gave you, and they have a way that you can just register, and they have both a phone application and a web-based application. So, and generally they have a free version that's got limited capabilities, but it's actually pretty good. But they're not totally seamless. They're sometimes clunky, but it's a good way to keep track, especially if there's changes in the passwords.
And then she also asked, how do you have access to ADP?
I got them to give in other words, they got access through their employer, and they had a login set up. So they basically gave me their login information. So again, there has to be a high degree of trust between you and the family that they're going to give you all of this very private and sensitive data. But in our case, it worked out well, and they were happy to give us the information. And what's best is if you can try to move off of that to where they can be in control of their own life. But for us, the pandemic has really slowed down that process, and so we've been still kind of nursing them along, because things have just been really hard, especially learning English, which is obviously the big threshold to learning anything in the U.S.
And I think that's the only ones in the chat, unless I missed one.
There was a lot of good comments I see in here. I mean, you guys can speak up that wrote comments in the chat section to share some of your experiences, because we have a really austere group here that you guys have been through this before, so we're not probably telling you anything new. So it's good to get your feedback too as well. Yeah, go ahead, Gene. You're on mute. Gene, you gotta go off. Okay, got it.
So, we're horrible at helping families become self-reliant. And nothing can be more complicated than what we're talking about. I guess I'm venting. That's just it. And how do we use all this information? I mean, and your team sounds phenomenal. I don't think we're that great. But how do we use that to help? I mean, the theme of this meeting is financial literacy. How do we use that to help them become capable of handling all this without us?
Well, try not to make decisions for them. Try to lay out options. Sorry, Jim, I jumped in.
Yeah, right.
Try to lay out options. If they ask you, what would you do? Then I would say what I would do in my circumstances, but explain that my circumstances are different than theirs. And also I would explain why I would do what I would do. Because otherwise, if they just hear the answer, then that's what they'll do without really, without it being a learning exercise. But you have to sort of make it a little bit Socratic method so that, that they're developing a way of thinking about financial issues that perhaps they didn't have to think about when everything was, cash or even just provided for them in the camps.
I think our role is also to walk beside our family and not draw them along behind us. We need to, from the get-go. The first couple of weeks are, of course, are hard, but beyond that, and I understand what you're saying about letting go, but if you start doing that early and walking beside them and let them ask you questions, that's fine. But let them do it. Let them make the decisions. And gradually, and I'm going to talk about, using the text. We get a lot of texts at the beginning asking questions, and those gradually fade out a little bit because they get it. I'm going to explain how one of my families would send me a picture of writing the rent check to make sure it had been done correctly. Well, that was great. Person did it. Just wanted verification that the numbers were correct and in the right spaces. And so, they get a big applause sign emoji, and they're learning that.
Right, because so much of what we're talking about is really like in line with you learning computer skills. I mean, our guy does not know how to use email.
Right.
I mean, like online banking. I mean,
It's daunting, no doubt about it.
It is.
And the different families have different capabilities. And the other thing we did is we're doing monthly meetings with them to review their budgets. We do an Excel spreadsheet budget kind of thing, and we also in our case we use Mint, which is it's an Intuit online application where you track their expenses, and it has little, and people say, well, how do they know how to read a bubble chart or even numbers on the thing? Well, here's what your goal is for the month, and here's what you spent. And where it goes, when they're really over budget, we say it's red, and we say, well, why do you think it's red? Why did it looks like you spent $1,000 more on cash than we have recorded? Where did you spend the money? And of course, we suspected it was not being used properly, and the person said they bought beer and cigarettes. I said, well, so we showed a graph where we showed how many beer and cigarette, how many cases or how many 6-packs of beer and how many packs of cigarette $1,000 would buy. And it's a lot of beer and a lot of cigarettes. So it was clear there was more going on than what there, but you try to use examples like that to not necessarily accuse them, but say, here's things that you need to look at. And it's hard, but like you say, it's hard. Other questions? Comments, other experiences?
Yeah.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
sorry. We have four current families. All of them lost SNAP during COVID. I don't know the reasons. I really don't know the reasons, but I guess I'm just raising that because it was hard to explain to them why were they losing that benefit in a time when their income was diminished.
That's obviously a DSS problem, and
Yeah.
the trick is how do you get a hold of DSS? You know, their phone lines were hard to get at. If you weren't the authorized rep, you couldn't speak for them. And so that's where being the authorized rep is really important, because then you can more quickly navigate those situations. So they should have been getting SNAP.
In
Everybody
fact,
lost it.
during,
Everybody lost it.
well, in fact, during COVID, you know, based on income, our family was not getting the full SNAP. But then at one point, there was a program passed where everybody was getting topped off and getting the full SNAP, even if their income actually would have normally meant a reduced SNAP benefit. So I don't know why all four of your families would have lost SNAP unless they lost all benefits because of passing the 12-month mark and not renewing, you know, or at least one of the families doing
Yeah,
that.
they're way past 12 months, but I think you put your finger on one thing, was that some weird stuff happened during COVID that was inexplicable by us. We
Yep.
couldn't say, why did they suddenly receive this kind of like this money? I don't know why. I mean, it's hard. If we don't understand why, how are they supposed to understand why? But yeah, these families are way beyond 1 year, I have to say.
Greg, any thoughts?
I think Gene put the nail on the head, which is, you know, DSS was really kind of incomprehensible for a while. I mean, you know, it was very difficult for even our staff in New Haven to navigate DSS during the pandemic. It did get better. And then, yes, they, you know, I think it might have been part of one of the federal relief packages that allowed for everyone to receive the maximum amount by family size for SNAP for a limited period. But yeah, I mean, I would, you know, certainly, you know, DSS is a little bit more reachable now. So Gene, maybe offline we can go over sort of the pattern that you experienced, because I wasn't aware that everybody lost SNAP in your case. Yes, so we will talk about that. I just want to address one comment before we move to Nancy's session. And that was Sheldon's comment about families sending money home even if they don't have it. This is a very common issue, whether refugees are co-sponsored or not. And I mean, all that we can do is advise them that, you know, like, especially if in a co-sponsored situation, they need to understand that just because they have chosen to send all of their cash to their family back home does not mean that you're going to replace it because of what they decided to do. That's part of understanding how to take responsibility for their finances. You know, ultimately, people are going to do what they're going to do. You know, if people feel that strongly, they're going to find a way to send money home. Usually, it's not a huge amount. I've heard some cases where, you know, somebody used their EITC refund and sent the entire amount to their family in East Africa. You know, $12,000 goes a long way in that part of the world. But, you know, it's not something that that we can necessarily do anything about, except explain to them that, you know, they're free to do what they want with their money, including sending it home to family or to support family, you know, but you're still responsible for yourselves.
I have a comment really
Okay,
quick.
Cindy.
Yeah. Okay. Just to Jean's question about, you know, how you take this information and sort of put it into action. A couple of things that we did recently, our family's been here a little over a year. We kind of let them fail but within reason. So, you know, mom's cell phone was going to end at the end of the month. And we said, you know, you've got to renew it. If you need help, you can ask us, but we're not going to do it for you. And she said, yeah. And then the end of the month came and she was like, oh, my phone doesn't work, which was not a catastrophic event, but she realized, hey, I've got to take care of this. And she actually did go, she went and bought a new cell phone, but that's beside the point. She helped herself. And the other thing we did was the family recently moved and we went over and we talked to them about what moving entails. And we said, you know, let's make a list of what you need to do. And you think of things, we'll think of things. They didn't think of anything. But then we went back and decided what are the things that really need to get done so that they don't lose benefits and things like that. And what are the things that we can let slide? So when they fail, they know, okay, now I'm going to remember this every time this happens, you know, every time I move, I have to do this, or, you know, things like that. So I think it's hard to do because we don't want to see them fail. But I think if it's not something that's catastrophic, it's a really good learning experience. That's all I had to say.
Very good.
And I Cindy and I are both interfaith partnership for refugee resettlement. I mean, you know, my observation is I wish we'd let them fail a little more sooner, you know, because I think those have been really good lessons for them.
Fair point. It's all about being reasonable. All right, so without further ado, we're going to continue the presentation, this time with Nancy Twynham.
Now, before I start with the presentation, and I think everybody is picking up on this, what you're hearing tonight is based on our 3 individual experiences. So there's oftentimes many ways to get the job done. One thing that came up tonight was the travel loan. Jim's group paid it off in a lump sum. Rich's group set up an installment plan, and I deferred it twice for our family. So much depends on the individual family. So I think this is an experienced group on here, so I think you're aware of that. But what I'm going to talk about, a lot of it is more descriptive rather than prescriptive. So what do I do? What do I teach when I first meet with a family? I've done sort of 2.5 families, and I start out teaching about our currency because they can't do anything on their own without having some sense of the value and the actual dollars and change that they're going to get in their spending money. So, and I try to make it fun. We do little contests. Sometimes it's the kids versus the parents, or the husband versus the whatever. I give them each a pile of currency and cash, hold up a flashcard, and see who can reach it first, just to get them familiar with, with building odd amounts when they go to the grocery store. I also introduce spreadsheets to them because, as you've heard Jim mention, there are many times when these are useful in budgeting. Iris does have a template, which I have used. I also, because I do this, have made my own spreadsheet because it's a little less complicated than Iris's. And initially they just need to track a few things, like in their expenses, their rent or their electricity. So they don't need all the offerings in the Iris template at the beginning. And somehow this communications got on this slide, which, in the beginning, most of my communication has been with an interpreter. Our last family spoke Dari Farsi, and that's not, I speak French, but that's not my forte. So we do use interpreters a lot. Eventually, when they're a little more settled, we do use a lot of texting. But as opposed to email, those of you with kids know that email is not looked at very often, but texting gets their attention. But they still need to learn how to check an email, because sometimes we'll send out, or Iris will send out a lengthier communication, or the bank will send out something. So that And there's a lot of overlap with the people who work in employment as well as finance. Next slide, please. This is just to show you the example. The spreadsheet on the right is one that I made, and it just highlighted the rent, the phone, and the electric. The one on the left is Iris's spreadsheet, which you can certainly use, and it's easy to access from I guess from the manual. You can get to that spreadsheet, so that's available if you're used to using Excel. It's easy to make up one that fits your particular family. Next slide, please. So whenever, and I used to do this with with clients as well as with the refugees, explaining what budgeting is, and it's having to balance your expenses with your income, and that your expenses need to be contained within your income. Initially, their income, of course, is their food allowance, and then they get some pocket money once they arrive at one time. So they'll have some money for incidentals. You've heard Jim talk about the SNAP and the TFA, but meanwhile, they'll also get a weekly food allowance until SNAP and TFA becomes available to them from DSS. Employment income, that was slow coming for our families. It took them a long time to get a regular job, and that was primarily a language issue. As you know, most places won't employ somebody with no English because they can't understand the rules or the safety measures. So it took ours quite a while to develop a steady income stream. And of course, as I just mentioned, the major expenses, the rent, and you probably know that they need to pay from their cash assistance. They need to pay their share of the rent. I have drawn up a schedule for them so they know exactly how much they need to pay towards the rent each month. And I haven't had any trouble with the families getting it to me and getting it to me on time. But they do need to pay use half of their cash assistance towards the rent till the end of rental assistance. Utilities, you have to remember to transfer the utilities to the family's name. Eversource is not always easy to work with, as most of us know, unless you live down on the coast. But be persistent and it shall happen. Explaining, and we have other people besides finance people helping them understand what they can use SNAP for and what they have to use their own cash for in terms of groceries. Our families are in Waterbury, where they do use buses, and so another expense might be bus passes. And then, as I just mentioned, the travel loan, which typically starts 6 months after they've been here. And as I say, you can get a deferral, and I did do that for our families. Now they're paying it regularly on their own. Next slide, please. Important documents. I have provided our family with a beautiful plastic file box with file folders, and it's called the box. And every time I need something important, I say, go get the box. And they know to put in, initially they can't tell when something comes in the mail, and it may be an advertisement to sell them something, but they can't always distinguish initially whether it's junk mail or a bill. So initially they file their what appears to be bills in the file box, along with the other important documents that they get from DSS and from IRIS. And reminding them when they do get employed to keep the pay stubs, because they will have to substantiate their employment with DSS as well as for taxes down the road. One of my first tasks is teaching how to write numbers. So I write out 1 through 100 in numeral and in words. So, because our families are required to pay their rent by check. So they have to learn how to write a check pretty quickly. So that means knowing how to write numbers. Oops, that was mine. And in general, helping a family monitor their spending. My family requested that I be on their bank account so that I had access to it. So as somebody was just explaining, when I see, a very large expense at Costco, I might gently inquire and gently remind that maybe they need to look at their expenses more closely, so that they don't run out of money. And it constantly reinforcing the budget and prompt bill payment. I use a wall calendar initially to show them when bills are due. And that seemed to help them because, as you say, use of a computer at the beginning is virtually non-existent. They're more comfortable with a phone than with a computer. And my former life, I was a language teacher, among other things. So I tried to reduce the use of an interpreter whenever possible, even if you use an app on the phone to translate, but don't get too dependent on an interpreter. And despite all the, I'm looking at the question about Costco and Snap. Despite all the good efforts with the first family, and they were on their own, I still got a text saying no money for rent. Well, somebody was just talking about, we don't need to rescue them. We don't need to always bail them out. You may be a sounding board. Okay, what are your options? How are you going to reconcile or resolve this issue of rent money? And eventually they did. And I think they called on their friends, as a matter of fact, to help them out. But that's their prerogative to do that. So next slide, please. As be alert to scams. And this year, especially with COVID, and because our family, our last family, had a hard time finding work. When you get and this happened, and this is a real one, this was a text for a job offer, you need to teach your family not to share their personal information without checking with a team member first. Sometimes, of course, it's legitimate if the bank needs some information or something, but otherwise they should not be giving out their social security number, or their bank account, names of children, all of that. And as we all know, many work-at-home offers are scams, especially during COVID. This was, and I shared this just because it was so real to our family. This online rep needed for a stay-at-home job due to COVID, paid $950 a week with employment letter. Well, the next page, it said the work week was 8 hours per week for $950. After 2 months, it went up to $1,650 for the same 8 hours per week, and plus bonuses. And there would be a 3-minute video describing their job and how to do their job. And next slide, please. This is the actual check that was sent to our family. And goodness knows, there is, in fact, I researched this, there is a Union Bank. It happens to be a California bank. But, if this doesn't look real to us, certainly looks real to our families. Cashier's check for $3,540. And when they're not earning anything, that's pretty enticing. So this was, of course, to buy the computer and all the equipment, as well as provide them with some income. So I just, as I say, that check looks so real. Fortunately, he had presence of mind to ask his boss, at that time he did have a job, whether he could put this into his account. And so, he learned that he definitely couldn't. But this is what happens in these days. People are out, and all the people really want are is all the information, all the personal information. So just a word to caution your families. Next. And right close behind that is being paid under the table. And again, when you have a steady job, it's a legitimate job, and somebody offers you a job, but for cash, it's very, very tempting. I'm not talking about $20 to shovel snow or rake leaves or do a little job, but for employment where the employee is paid in cash and there are no taxes deducted, no social security paid, things like that. This is tempting, and sometimes they're friends. Friends can sometimes, in this family, they had friends that were not very helpful to them. So just alert them that they may be offered something that seems pretty good, but it's not very helpful to them. And I know Greg doesn't like me saying this, but Greg's my friend, he won't mind that you know, it could impact their getting the green card. And if it's serious enough, it could impact and lead up to deportation. So just caution them to do it on the up and up, and have those taxes deducted and social security paid and all those good things. They get most of the taxes back anyhow. Next.
I think we're losing Nancy.
Next slide, please. In addition, some of you probably know this. Am I there?
Yeah.
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. There are many tasks beyond teaching the family how to manage their own finances that the finance team has to do. And the first one, before a family ever arrives, determining who will be the fiduciary and set up a co-sponsored bank account. For me, my church happens to be the fiduciary. And although we have a totally separate bank account, it's under the umbrella of the church. And this allows all donations to be tax exempt. So, but you have to figure that out of who will take on that responsibility. You also have to track not only the family's income expenses, but the co-sponsors. And if you've done this before, there are a lot of expenses before a family arrives that need to be tracked, as well as income, donations. So those, I do all that on my own spreadsheet. And then setting up a reimbursement system. Again, because I used to be a teacher, I'm big on making forms for our team members to request reimbursement as long as they have a receipt. You can do this online. We met weekly, so our team members were very happy to do a hard copy of a request with a receipt, and then I would return the money the following week. But just so there's some means of because I did not like our team members being out of money, even though IRIS was ultimately reimbursing us, say, for a bed or a seat or whatever. I didn't want our team members to be out of money personally, so I reimbursed them very promptly. Next slide, please. We also oversee the R&P funds, including reimbursement for expenses, as long as they're, when I say signed receipt, I mean signed by the family. For instance, if you buy a bed, you have to get the family to sign the receipt before submitting it to IRIS for reimbursement, or whatever it is, bus passes or initial groceries or initial utilities, whatever you're getting reimbursed for from IRIS and the R&P funds, you need a signed receipt. And I certainly required a signed receipt for our team members to get reimbursed. That's just good practice. And also to be timely to get your submission for reimbursement in. If you can get everything for the initial setup and the monthly rent in by the end of the first month, and then monthly for the subsequent rent payments, that would be great. I acknowledge every single donation. I think that's good practice. I think it also, on our thank you note, it says that it's a 503c company or a business and their donation is tax exempt. But I just think it's good practice to thank people for their donations. We also pay the interpreters if no volunteers. We spent about $7,000 last year just on interpreters. And we also pay the background check company, which has been Sterling Volunteers. So there are a few other things besides helping the family that the finance team needs to do. And, you know, at the end, I just want to add, enjoy the process. It can be crazy. It can be unpredictable. I mean, certainly we did not expect to put on a wedding, which we did the day before last. But ultimately, it's all so rewarding, and that's why those of us who have done it several times keep coming back. So that's what I have for the formal part, but I'm happy to see if there are any questions. Somebody wrote in the chat about Costco and SNAP. That is correct. No, so most families do not, but sometimes most families cannot get a Costco membership initially, but sometimes they have friends who take them to Costco. And how did you teach your group not to rescue your family over and over? We have, as one of our leaders, you know, a very strong person who ran a business and helped us all understand that our job is not to rescue them. And we don't want to see them fail. And if it's, you know, catastrophic or, you know, obviously we're going to step in. But for routine day-to-day situations, we had, somebody mentioned the car. We had one family that got a free car. That was, what a mistake that was. It kept breaking down. So, you know, initially we helped with that because we felt we got them into that situation. But you just have to remind yourselves, our job is not to rescue. Our job is to help and to lead. Because we meet so frequently, we've been meeting all year on Zoom, but before COVID, we met every week in person. And so collectively as a team, we could reinforce the notion that, you know, you can't have the savior complex because you'll never get them on their feet and independent. So it's just the constant, there's no special trick to that, but it's the constant reminder. I was there. I don't see any other questions, but maybe there's some questions that weren't put in the chat. Are there other questions or comments? Things that have worked that you want to share? I don't see it.
Well, it looks like you slayed, Nancy. Everybody's just chock full of information.
Or they're asleep.
No, at least the ones I can see are not sleeping. So, yeah. All right. Well, then let's move on to the final portion of this presentation with Rich Stein from Newtown. And after his portion, we'll have time, you know, to ask any questions about his portion or any other portion of the evening. So take it away, Rich.
All righty, and I start with the next slide. Very good. So IPRR in Newtown, we have had 3 families, and our last family arrived March 18th of 2020. So if you need any reminders, that was the day before everything shut down and nobody could come into the country, which really made resettling that family a real challenge. We'll just leave it at that. So what I'm going to be talking about is, choosing a bank and trying to talk about how to build some sort of credit history. And it's important to realize that each family has to be taken, for their own experiences, their own aptitude, just how well are they getting the financial explanations that you give them. And, based on that, you can sort of figure out just how far can they go, initially in terms of, building a more or less sophisticated financial footprint. So when we choose a bank, and frankly, we chose Bank of America the first time because our first family, the husband got work very quickly, and there was a Bank of America branch right across the street from his work. So that seemed convenient. We went in and, the customer service person spoke fluent French. The husband spoke at least reasonable African French, and so they could understand each other quite well. Bank of America has really made us look smart because their suite of products, really fits with what, a refugee needs, which is, low fee and no fee products, because, when you're not dealing with a lot of money, fees really, hit home in a hurry. So, and there's trade-offs. In the case of a checking account, our families haven't had a checkbook. They pay all their bills online. And, I personally, if I write a check a month, it's a lot. So I don't see it as a real disadvantage. And even though, as prior comments have been made that, learning a computer, even using the phone is a challenge, they've understood how to use their phone to pay their bills. And it does help with, in the case of, for instance, wives who haven't had education and are functionally illiterate, but, they can see the numbers on the screen and they can recognize them from currency, and therefore they can, learn to use, the online features of the Bank of America app. And by the way, I don't work for Bank of America. I'm just saying we've had very good luck with them. So our first two families were Congolese. They were from different ethnicities. So, the help that we had, in terms of interpretation for the first family did us absolutely no good for the second family. Fortunately, the first family, as I said, spoke French. We have a native, Frenchman in our group who's a naturalized US citizen, but, French is his mother tongue. And he even served in the French Navy in Africa, so that he had learned sort of African French and was able to communicate quite clearly. I speak halting French. I can explain things and say things better than I can understand things. So, that meant that it would sort of tell me what they said because I couldn't always catch, the response. But, we made it work. The second family, we were fortunate because I was mom and 3 adult sons, and the middle son spoke English. And so explaining the finance was, went all right because, he was college educated, he spoke reasonable English. And so it was just a matter of learning the concepts of, how to do business in a country where cash isn't necessarily king. as a matter of fact, what I've explained to all three is I would show them a plastic ATM card or show them their, their DSS benefits card and say, in this country, plastic is almost like cash. And, that they didn't believe it at first because, they either had never had any experience with an ATM or, even if they'd seen one used, they'd never used it themselves. And so, this was really just a foreign concept. They came from cash economies. So the first two families moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, because, both of their ethnicities had their own communities in great numbers out in Grand Rapids. One of the families moved out to Grand Rapids, not only for community, but they were also convinced that Michigan was warmer than Connecticut in the winter. And we wish them good luck. And, there you go. The third family looks like they will be in Danbury for the foreseeable future, which is terrific. We love them, and we were afraid they were going to have to move to Waterbury because Danbury just was, just too expensive for the amount of money that they were able to make at this point. Next slide, please. So again, these ATM machines, our babies and, toddlers play with plastic ATM cards, putting them into slots of, baby toys. And yet for our families, adults, they didn't have that visual experience and understanding about putting the short end of the credit card or ATM card into the slot and orienting the magnetic stripe. And it took a lot of time to have them get it, but they did, and it's like anything else. You're just patient and you're looking for new ways to explain it, and you show them the picture of where the magnetic stripe is on the machine, and soon enough they figure out how to orient it and get it right. Again, you don't have to be that sophisticated in terms of what you do on an ATM machine anyway, because you're really either looking up balances, either in their bank account or bank accounts, both checking and savings, or they're looking up their TFA cash balance and their, their SNAP balance. So it never came down to having out-of-network charges, because they were all three families, for whatever reason, just refused to stray from their own bank, branch. And so none of the three families had ever incurred an out-of-network charge. So, that was fine. That was good. They understood that if they went to the wrong ATM, they would get a charge. And, we went through the whole, which symbol to look for on the ATM machine, but I think all three of them just decided on their own that it was just something that they didn't need to bother with if they just made sure they had cash from their branch. Next slide, please. So once the paychecks started, we encouraged them from the very beginning to have a certain amount of their paycheck go into a savings account. And have the balance go into checking to pay current bills. What we said is that if you put this money into this separate account, to make it almost like a one-way account. So the money went in, but it wouldn't come out until you were trying to realize a financial goal. That worked with varying success, I will say that, but at least they had this idea of trying to segregate money out to save for a goal. The first goal was to already start saving so they would have a security deposit and first and last month's rent for the next apartment, because again, due to the time constraint of how much time you have to find an apartment when we get notice that, they're coming, and because of the various, regulations about how many kids, what genders and ages, they would end up with very expensive apartments sometimes. And so they knew they would be moving after a year, and they knew that, the security deposit we put down, we would expect back, and therefore they had to save for that. So the more they could save, then the sooner they would also be able to buy a car if we couldn't find one that was either free or cheap, that was, mechanically sound, and that the idea of eventually owning a house. So we basically tried to gather up their financial goals, ask them to sort of dream a bit, plus inform them about goals that some people have in this country, because in some cases their imaginations were such that they didn't think about, college for their kids, because, what a foreign concept. You just hoped your kid could get through secondary school, So the savings account, they recognized as a way of, buying some freedom, freedom from a landlord eventually, for instance, which, obviously anybody who's owned a house knows that you're then chained to the house for all the repairs and the payments and whatever else. But again, it's yours. So at least they have the idea that this is a good thing and something that's worthy of putting money aside. Next slide, please. So we also ran into the issue of money to relatives. And, we first of all just said, look, until you really understand the money that's coming in and the money that has to go out to pay bills, that it's wise not to, spend money on relatives back home until you can really get a command of, what the, I'll use my technical term, the gazintas and the gazautas of your checking account. We also said that we don't send money that way, and if you want to use Western Union or whatever else, that's fine, but we don't know, none of us in our group had any experience in terms of what was the safest and most cost-effective way to do that. So it was like, well, if you do it, you're on your own, because we can't help you. That just wasn't within our experience base. This was also something that came up very early, sending money to relatives. And what we tried to explain, what I tried to explain, was that they were getting benefits from the state of Connecticut, and those benefits were paid for by taxpayers. And the idea was that, these benefits that they were receiving was to help them get onto their feet while they were looking for a job. They had to, learn or improve their English, and, they had to actually find someone to hire them. And so that, the taxpayers understood that, but, taxpayers pay their taxes, and it's not their, decision as to what the money gets used for. It's the family's decision. But that, if you were to query a taxpayer, they might say, gee, I'm not paying taxes so we can support somebody in Africa. I'm paying taxes so these people can get on their feet. And, that's a pretty sort of concrete explanation to this. But we at least explained, the sort of the optics of sending, benefit money, from TFA back to the families in Africa. Again, it was up to them what they did. It was their money. So last page here. As I mentioned, you really have to sort of understand where the family's at and see what they can really handle on their own. And even then, you can get surprised. You think there's good understanding. And yeah, I'm on the last slide there. Yeah, thanks, Brady. So we had a GoFundMe, for our third family, just because, again, arriving at the very start of the pandemic shutdown, they really had challenges that, other families just didn't face. And so, we did a GoFundMe to help them with some of these extraordinary expenses. And for their travel loan, with the International Organization for Migration, the IOM travel loan, what we did for the third family is we advised them that rather than paying it off, we should, use the money to pay all but 6 months worth off, so that they could then make 6 installment payments, which would show up on their credit report as, that they had a loan and that they paid it off. So that was kind of our answer to what to do with the IOM loan. We were fortunate, we were able to, raise a really nice chunk of money, and it went to several things. It helped pay for extra English lessons. It, for the mom who had really not had formal schooling past about the 2nd or 3rd grade. And, we were just able to, use that money in a way that the family, first of all would appreciate, but also to help build their credit with the IOM loan. So in terms of establishing credit, the main thing, of course, as we all know, is make your payments in full and on time, and, do the right things so that you don't miss those payments. So what we did is we set up the IOM loan as, like as an automatic payment. The rent payments, we never did get the third family onto, paying the full rent. Instead, they were still paying us. One partner in the marriage just couldn't, resist spending money that really shouldn't have been going to the various things that money was being spent. We suspect that money was going back to the relatives. We suspect that the money was going to a storefront church. We certainly know there was a lot of, fashion being purchased as well. So we had to collect the money from them in cash to make sure that the full rent would go in on time. But before some of that was really being discovered, we did sign the family up. As soon as they had $300 saved, we signed them up for a cash secured credit card. And that went well for a number of months because, the bill payer in the family was very responsible and was able to make the payments in full down to zero each month. And by doing that, they were establishing a track record of on-time payments. And the idea was going to be that after 6 months, then the bank would entertain giving them an actual credit card, and they would get their $300 back. Unfortunately, that's when we started running into some payment issues. And, they still to date have not been able to apply for an actual credit card that isn't cash secured. But they're working on rebuilding the credit. I overestimated what they could do as a partnership together. One person got it, the other person either didn't get it or refused to get it. And I suppose one's as good as the other in terms of, being able to, build a credit score and sort of branch out into other areas. So, we recognize that, the families are each going to be able to do more or less in terms of establishing good credit. You have to be on top of it all the time to make sure the payments are being made in, like I said, in full and on time. And, that's kind of how most of us do achieve what we dream of, because few of us can plunk down cash for a house. most of us, take on credit, take on payments to buy the car that we want. And none of that's bad as long as we can manage the debt in a responsible way. So, the refugee families we've worked with, just like many Americans, what they want is sometimes more than what they can actually financially handle. And so whether you're already American born, or you come to this country, some families have to learn some of these lessons the hard way, but hopefully they're the better for it when they dig their way out. So that's really what I have. So our formal presentation is over. And I'm assuming that Greg, you'll sort of lead us through question and answer if there's any more questions to field.
Yes, indeed. But before we do that, just because we're running up on 7:30, which is when we wanted, which is when we're supposed to end, feel free to stay on if you would like. And but Grady is going to put a link to the evaluation of this session in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind clicking on that so that you can complete that after the once we're all gone, we'd really appreciate that so that we can get your feedback for this evening. Any questions or comments for Rick? Rich, excuse me. Your colleague's name is Rick. And it's
yes, it is. Hi, Jean.
Hi, Rich touched on something that we've encountered recently and currently with our fifth family, and that's, I'll put it as marital differences in terms of handling finances. Today, I was asked to go down to the bank to interpret, which I did, but what the banker said to me is, look, we've encountered, friction between these two people in terms of how they're dealing with, who takes the money out of the bank account. And we're not here to solve the differences between those two people. And I looked at the man and I said, me neither, right? But so they wanted to open a savings account with their tax refunds, which was a substantial amount of money. And I was able to repeat what I've been saying to them for months, which is, look, you guys, you need to talk about these things and you need to work these out together, because we're not going to solve your discord, and neither is the bank. So it was good to be like face to face and just say to them both, do you both want the savings account? Do you both agree to put this money in? Do you understand your debit card doesn't apply to this, etc.? So it was new to us to encounter these kind of, we call it a cultural issue, because there's a kind of dominance of the man and it doesn't go over very well. But when they come to us to vent, we shrug our shoulders and say, sorry, we're not going to solve this problem for you.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, Jean, because I can give you a similar example of a family that had been here for 3 years when the group contacted me and asked me to go up and meet with them because they were at their wits' end. The couple had bought 2 cars and they bought an entire brand new living room set from Raymore and Flanagan on credit. And they were going to the group to ask for money to pay their rent because they didn't have enough money to pay their rent. So that was a fun conversation. Basically, what we all said is, okay, this is your mess. There's something called credit counseling, and that's what you need to do so that you can recover your credit and get your finances back on track. So you certainly don't want to let anybody get to that point, but a lot of what happened in that situation had to do with what mom wants and what dad wants, and people getting caught up in, consumer activity frenzy, which we all know happens in the US all the time, but this is what can happen to a refugee family that is way in over its head when they think, why are you buying French provincial furniture for your small apartment? Like, why? But that's what they decided to do. And like a lot of other situations present themselves, it's okay, so how are you going to get yourselves out of it? This is you, this is what you did. So you're right on point, Gene. You know, and it can be very frustrating for groups. It can be frustrating for us. I mean, refugees are people, they have personalities. They had them when they came here, they still have them. And at some point you have to just be like, okay, it's up to you.
I will say, and we didn't use this with our family, although, you know, maybe we should have. There is a website out there called themoneycouple.com, and it is, you know, about a husband and wife financial advisor team that actually counseled families to listen to each other, because they described 5 money personalities, and that each of us have a primary and a secondary money personality. And, you know, if you're a saver, then your spouse who's a spender, you're just like talking in completely different terms. And naturally, there's going to be miscommunication because you don't view the world the same way. So, you know, you can take a free quiz on the website to find out your money personalities, and you might want to do it with, you know, a significant other just to see what theirs is. I have not considered doing this with the refugee families because the questions are really geared more toward, you know, upper middle class, you know, socioeconomic scale. You know, it talks about like, do you go to the same restaurant or do you try different restaurants? Well, you know, our families don't go to restaurants to speak of, you know, so that's not applicable. But I'm just mentioning it in terms of like husbands and wives that are really talking past each other, you know, that it helps for them to start to really listen to the other person. Not that that's helped with our current family.
And Greg, you brought up a point, and I deal with this, or when I was still in financial planning with real clients, but unlike Rick, I do not introduce credit cards to our family. They will get there soon enough. I think managing a debit card is good, and most of them can handle that, but I mean, come on, it is so tempting if you have that credit card and you say, well, you know, I'm going to get a raise or I'm going to get a better job or whatever. And it doesn't happen, not in this day and age. So I would be really careful about introducing credit cards to the family until they're really, really established and on steady incomes. And they'll figure that part out all on their own with the help of their friends. I'm not sure that we need to do that, but that's my viewpoint, because I've seen too many Americans get themselves into deep trouble with credit cards.
That's why I like the cash secured credit card, because it's like training wheels, you know.
Right. But you don't go buy Raymore and Flanagan and buy a furniture set with a $300 card. So
precisely. On that we agree absolutely.
But yeah,
So Mark and Vivian, you said you got your family a house through Habitat for Humanity, and you said you just contact them to see what the application process. Was there a lot of competition for that? I think of that of assisted housing. There's a list like a mile long. Was there a big list for yours, and how did that process work out? You're on mute, by the way. Maybe you're not there?
no, they're there, but they're on mute.
Yeah.
They're not there.
I can get back to you on that. My recollection was.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, Mark.
This is more, yes. Yeah, I was in between moving things around here. The question was there a lot of competition for the Habitat home?
Right.
There was not a lot of competition, and they're still looking, at least in our area, for people. Each area is different.
It's because most of the families don't have the sufficient credit.
Yeah. You have to have sufficient credit and money to go into building a habitat home. And then of course there's sweat equity in it. But as far as competition, no, there was not competition. They do accept a lot of applications. And they like, at least the one in our area really likes refugee families.
And what area are you guys in?
Norwich, New London County.
Okay.
And they were great to work with and very supportive. And the families not only put their own sweat equity into it, some of the volunteers joined, and they did get other families to help out. So it was quite an experience.
How much did it cost? Is that too personal or?
To build the house, I don't know what the final cost of the house was.
Approximately 130,000.
Oh.
130, okay.
They're leasing the land and the house cost approximately 130,000 to build. And the house that they built is a duplex.
They get a no interest loan.
Yeah, and they get a 0 interest loan.
Wow.
That whole habitat holds it, but the land is leased. It's not owned. And they started building duplex type houses here to more efficiently use the land.
Great.
So is a duplex where the like your refugee family lived in one, and then the next family that Habitat accepted lived next door? Is that what it was?
It just happened in our situation that both refugee families lived next door, because the next family that got approved was the other refugee family.
Wow.
So they're both living there.
That's great.
Yeah, it was very nice for them.
That's sweet.
I'm sorry, so they own half of the duplex, or they own the whole duplex and can rent the other half out for income?
No, they can't rent it. They own half of the duplex.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Tell them that these are families that have been here.
And just so you know, these are families who've been here approximately 5 years.
Almost 5.
Yeah, almost 5 years. So it doesn't happen immediately.
Yeah.
And it's hard sometimes for us to explain to new families arriving that you can't do that right away, because everyone wants to have, and I understand that, wants to have their own home. And they built a nice house, I have to say.
That's great.
Yeah, one of the families is Sudanese, so Rich, there's a very strong possibility that your family knows them, because the Sudanese are like that. They all, everyone knows each other everywhere. So that's a good thing, because
Yeah.
you can consult with them. They're great.
But also, Greg, friends can sometimes take the wrong path or try to get families down the wrong path.
Well, I totally get what you mean, because I know that you had, I mean, we had that problem with one of your families.
Right. So you just have to
know.
be cautious about friends.
Yes, definitely. But, in this situation, they're tied with Start Fresh in New London. I've worked very closely with them. And yeah. And the woman who interpreted for the family, in the Sudanese family in Danbury, also knows the family in New London. Yeah. But post-pandemic, the Sudanese community is due to have a huge party like they did about 4 years ago that everyone should go to, if I could make sure you guys know about it. Very festive, lots of food. Sudanese food is like Ethiopian food, so if you like Ethiopian food, you'll be like in heaven. And, the incense, the dancing, the drums, it's just phenomenal. So, yeah. We Sudanese have it going on.
Where do the Sudanese tend to live? Are they clustered in one town or area?
I mean, most of the Sudanese, that were resettled through IRIS, live in the New Haven area, and have tended to be concentrated here. I mean, we've resettled a Sudanese family in Danbury and a Sudanese family, two Sudanese families in New London.
And they,
So,
and Greg, to add to your point, yes, they do definitely know each other. They're connected.
Okay.
Recently, there was a cookout at Norwich in the park, and a number of Sudanese families from across the state came to this family hosting a cookout, and they're very supportive of each other. At least that was our experience.
no, that makes complete sense to me.
Thank you, Greg, for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, for organizing.
Well,
Whole
thank
series
you.
was good.
Well, thank you all for your presentations. And sorry, what, Jean?
I said, it's good to see everybody.
Yes.
Someday we'll
absolutely.
meet in person again.
I know. That's something that we definitely want to do when we can all congregate safely. You know, we want to do kind of something like what we did a year into the co-sponsorship program when Governor Malloy came to speak, and you know, so it would be nice to replicate that with the current governor.
I thought you were going to say that nice picnic that you had in New Haven. Don't you remember that picnic? That with all the area families?
I don't think I went to that. I was at Lighthouse Point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't there, but I know that co-sponsors did go to that.
Yep.
So yeah, that usually happens around this time of the year, but I don't think it's happening this year. So,
Right.
but anyway, we'll figure out a time to get together and celebrate. But thank you, Nancy, Rich, and Jim, for a really solid presentation. And thank you for being here. And thank you, Grady, for your expertise and technical assistance. Went without a hitch. And everybody have a great evening. And
Yep.
stay cool.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Greg. Good night.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.